Imagine waking up one morning, and by the time you go to sleep that night, 3 of your neighbors are dead. The next morning, 2 more. Within a week, half your street is gone. Within a month, your entire village has been wiped off the map. No bombs, no war, no warning. Now imagine this happening simultaneously across every single country in Europe, every city, every town, every farm, for 7 straight years. This was not a movie. This was not fiction. This was Europe between 1347 and 1353. And the disease responsible killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people, in an era when the entire world population was only around 400 million.
But here is the question nobody asks. How did it end? Because it did end. Civilization survived, and the way it ended and what came after is one of the most surprising, counterintuitive, and honestly hopeful stories in all of human history. Today on Truth Behind History, the real story of the Black Death, where it actually came from, how it really spread, and the shocking truth about how Europe not only survived, but came out of it fundamentally transformed. Stay with me. This one is going to change how you think about disaster.
Here is what most people think they know about the Black Death. It was a disease that came out of nowhere in medieval Europe. Rats carried it, it caused black spots on your skin, hence the name. It spread because medieval people were dirty and superstitious and had no idea what germs were. Millions died because nobody knew anything about medicine or science. The church told people it was God's punishment, everyone panicked, and eventually it just burned itself out. The survivors went back to their miserable medieval lives and nothing really changed. Oh, and the nursery rhyme, Ring Around the Rosie, everyone knows that secretly about the Black Death. Ring around the rosy, the rash, a pocket full of posies, flowers to mask the smell of death, ashes, ashes, we all fall down, everyone dying. Clean, simple, and almost entirely wrong.
The real story is far more complex, far more global, and honestly, far more interesting than the version we learned in school. Because the Black Death did not just kill people, it killed an entire social order. And what replaced it quietly set the stage for the Renaissance, modern medicine, labor rights, and the collapse of feudalism. Let us start at the beginning, the real beginning.
The Black Death did not start in Europe. It did not start with rats on a ship. It started, according to the best current historical and genetic evidence, in Central Asia, most likely in or around the region of modern-day Kyrgyzstan and northern China, sometime in the early 1330s. In 2022, a landmark study published in the journal Nature analyzed ancient DNA from graves in the Chu Valley of Kyrgyzstan, dated to 1338 and 1339. The headstones on these graves actually mentioned an extraordinary mortality, an unusual thing to record. Scientists extracted DNA from the teeth of the buried bodies and found unmistakable traces of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague, in a form genetically very close to the ancestor of all later Black Death strains. So the plague was already killing people in Central Asia nearly a decade before it reached Europe. How did it travel so far? The answer is one of history's great ironies. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, had created the most efficient trade network the medieval world had ever seen. The Silk Road was booming. Goods, people, ideas, and unfortunately bacteria were moving faster and farther than ever before. The plague moved west along trade routes, through Persia, through the Middle East, devastating populations along the way that Western history rarely acknowledges. By the time it reached the Crimean port city of Kaffa on the Black Sea in 1346, it had already been killing for years across Asia and the Middle East. The Kaffa incident, biological warfare in 1346. Here is something most people have never heard. The plague's entry into Europe may have involved one of the earliest recorded acts of biological warfare in history.
Mongol forces were besieging the city of Kaffa, a Genoese trading post, when plague broke out in their own army. According to a contemporary account by the Italian notary Gabriele de Musis, the Mongol commanders ordered the corpses of their plague victims to be loaded onto catapults and hurled over the city walls into Kaffa. Whether this alone caused the outbreak inside the city is debated by historians, but Genoese merchants fleeing Kaffa by ship in 1347 did carry the plague into the Mediterranean. Their ships landed in Sicily, and from there, it was unstoppable.
How it actually spread. Here is where the rat story gets complicated. Yes, rats were involved. The bacterium Yersinia pestis lived in the fleas that fed on black rats. When the rats died, the fleas jumped to the nearest warm body, usually a human. This is the classic bubonic plague transmission route, and it is real. But recent research has complicated this picture significantly. The plague spread far too fast across Europe to be explained by rat flea transmission alone. A 2018 study from the University of Oslo modeled the spread patterns and concluded that in many regions, particularly in northern Europe, human fleas and body lice transmitting the disease directly between people played a far larger role than previously understood. There was also pneumonic plague, an airborne version that infected the lungs and could be spread by simply breathing near an infected person. This form was nearly 100% fatal and spread at terrifying speed. So the Black Death was not one disease in one form. It was multiple transmission routes operating simultaneously, which is why nothing the medieval world tried could stop it.
What people actually did? Medieval people were not simply passive and helpless. They were genuinely trying to understand and stop the disaster using the best frameworks they had available. The city of Venice, one of Europe's great trading powers, invented something remarkable in 1377. They began requiring all ships arriving from plague-affected areas to anchor offshore and wait for 30 days before anyone could disembark. This practice was later extended to 40 days. In Italian, 40 is quaranta. That is where the word quarantine comes from. Venice invented quarantine in the 14th century, and it worked well enough that the city survived multiple plague waves better than many of its neighbors. Some cities sealed their gates. Some burned the belongings of the dead. Some appointed public health officials, another medieval innovation, to track and report deaths. These were not random acts of superstition. They were rational responses to an observed pattern, even without germ theory.
The death toll estimates come from centuries of historical demographic research. The most widely cited scholarly consensus, drawn from the work of historians including Oli Benedictau in his comprehensive 2004 study, The Black Death, 1346 to 1353, The Complete History, estimates that approximately 50% of Europe's population died, roughly 25 million people on the continent alone, with total global mortality potentially reaching 75 to 200 million when Asia and the Middle East are included. The 2022 Nature study on the Kyrgyzstan graves, led by researchers from the University of Tübingen and the Max Planck Institute, is the most significant recent breakthrough in pinpointing the plague's geographic and temporal origin, providing ancient DNA evidence that had never been available before. The biological warfare account from Kaffa comes from Gabriele de Musis, writing around 1348 to 1349. And while some historians debate how directly the catapulted corpses caused the outbreak, the account itself is considered a genuine contemporary document. The ring around the rosy myth, by the way, has been thoroughly debunked by folklorists. The rhyme does not appear in written records until the late 19th century, more than 500 years after the Black Death. It was almost certainly a children's game rhyme with no plague connection whatsoever.
Here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody expects. The Black Death did not just destroy Europe. In a series of deeply counterintuitive ways, it rebuilt it. Better. Labor rights were born in the aftermath. Before the plague, Europe operated under feudalism. Peasants were essentially tied to the land. They worked for noble landlords in exchange for protection, with little freedom and almost no bargaining power. Wages were fixed, movement was restricted.
The system had been locked in place for centuries. Then, half the workforce died. Suddenly, the surviving peasants, the farmers, the craftsmen, the laborers, were extraordinarily valuable. There were not enough out there to work all the land. Lords who had previously treated peasants as disposable now had to compete for their labor. For the first time in European history, ordinary working people could demand higher wages. They could leave one lord for another who offered better conditions. They could negotiate. England's Statute of Laborers in 1351, a law specifically designed to force wages back down to pre-plague levels, is perhaps the most telling document of this period. The fact that the government felt the need to pass such a law tells you everything. Workers had gained power so quickly that the ruling class panicked and tried to legislate it away. They largely failed.
The Renaissance connection. Here is the twist within the twist. The Black Death did not delay the Renaissance. It helped cause it. The Church, which had promised divine protection to the faithful, had spectacularly failed to stop the plague. Priests died alongside sinners. Prayer did not work. The institutional authority of the Catholic Church took a devastating credibility hit from which it never fully recovered in the same form. This created an intellectual space. People began questioning received authority. They began looking at the ancient Greek and Roman texts with fresh eyes, texts that discussed the natural world in terms of observation and reason rather than divine will. The humanist movement that drove the Renaissance drew directly from this post-plague crisis of faith in institutions. Additionally, the sudden concentration of wealth, as inheritance passed through devastated family lines accumulating in fewer hands, created a new merchant class with money to spend on art, architecture, and learning. The Florence of the Medici family, ground zero of the Renaissance, was a city that had lost between half and two-thirds of its population to the plague just 2 generations earlier. The Black Death broke the medieval world so completely that something genuinely new had room to grow in its place.
So, what is the real legacy of the Black Death? It was the single greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. It killed indiscriminately kings and peasants, clergy and criminals, artists and farmers. It exposed the limits of medieval medicine, the fragility of social systems, and the terrifying power of an invisible enemy that nobody understood. But it also, and this is the part that matters, forced the world to change. It invented quarantine. It gave birth to labor rights. It cracked the foundation of feudalism. It shook the authority of institutions that had gone unchallenged for centuries. And it cleared space, in the most brutal way imaginable, for the Renaissance, for humanism, for the early stirrings of the scientific method. The plague did not end because of any single breakthrough. It faded through a combination of acquired immunity in surviving populations, improved public health responses, changing rat populations, and possibly shifts in the bacterium itself. It came back in waves for centuries. The Great Plague of London was 1665, 300 years later, but never again with the same total devastation. And Ring Around the Rosie? Just a children's game. Some myths die harder than the plague itself. If this video made you see medieval history differently, or made you think about how civilizations respond to catastrophe, drop a comment and tell me what surprised you most. And if you want more of these deep dives into the real stories behind history, subscribe to Truth Behind History. We dig where the textbooks stop. New video every week. See you in the next one.